here and to speak about my favorite topic. I'm a little obsessive about bats. Ask anyone that knows me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everybody who is attending this talk. As I'll get into, bats face a lot of conservation challenges that are very unique to their biology and also their kind of public image. So the most we can do to highlight their benefits and what they do, and they're amazing animals. I always love opportunities to do that. So again, thank you for inviting me. Quick background on myself. I won't belabor it. I've been working with wildlife pretty much right out of college, so a little over 20 years now. And I kind of bounced around in my 20s to different field projects and was a field tech on all sorts of things, from like African carnivores, which was amazing, and lynx in Colorado and prairie chickens in Kansas. And in 2009, I got a job working on bats. And that was really the first time I'd ever spent much time thinking about them, because I always thought I was going to work with carnivores. And I got this bat job, and it was right just after white nose had emerged, and there were still a lot of unknown questions, but it was clear to me that not only were these amazing animals, but they really were facing an existential crisis, if you will. So that's my background, and I've been dedicated and in love with the little critters ever since. And I came to Connecticut in 2021 during COVID to work for the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. I stumble over it too every time, as the bat biologist. So with that, I'll stop talking about myself and start talking about bats. Okay, so my talk is Bats, Diversity and Conservation in Connecticut Beyond. I always like to start any talk. Uh-oh. Wait, now I don't know how to progress. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I always start this talk by kind of framing a discussion around bats, around really kind of understanding this term biodiversity. And I think a lot of us have a very intuitive sense of what this is. It's kind of in the word itself, biological diversity. But one of the things that kind of, there's nuance to this, right? Or there's kind of layers beyond just the word and the term itself that I think are really important to talk about, and understand why bats serve as such a good model for understanding this concept and why they're important and critical components of biodiversity. So the first kind of component, if you will, of biodiversity is the compositional component. And this is how many species are there in a given area, and how abundant or rare are they? This is kind of, I think, what most people think about, right? Who's there? How many are there? But it goes a little further, and then we can talk about structural biodiversity. And this is referring to how species are arranged across the landscape, right? You can imagine a system such as these two forest systems that I've kind of depicted here, one being very kind of complex. There's multiple age classes and different species of trees present, versus this more monocultured kind of pine plantation, if you will. And these are obviously going to support very different numbers of species in very different abundances. And then the third term, functional biodiversity, this is the crux of biodiversity, right? This is how the structural components and the compositional components interact in order to sustain biodiversity. And so this picture of a pollinating bat or a nectar feeding bat is a really great example. Pollination is definitely one of these functional biodiversity processes that help promote biodiversity and sustain it. And bats serve as a really good model for this because there's just a lot of different types of bats. They are incredibly diverse. They're the second most diverse group of mammals on the planet, next to rodents. But there's over 1,400 different types of bats so far that we've been able to count and identify. And that number still grows as molecular kind of techniques and DNA kind of reveals a little bit more about relationships between species that we can't always see. And as you can see from the map, basically bats occur everywhere across the globe, except for those extreme polar regions where there's really not a lot of biodiversity anyway. And because bats can fly, it actually makes them really interesting in terms of biodiversity, because their ability to fly means that they are often the only native mammals to an island chain. So an example of that is the Hawaiian hoary bat. That is the only truly native mammal to the Hawaiian Islands, which is pretty fascinating. And it just happens to be a hoary bat, which is just a lovely creature. Um, okay, and with so many different bats occurring in so many different places, this means that they're doing a lot of different things, right? Bats have evolved to fill all sorts of ecological niches. Their dietary diversity really reflects this. So we've got our insectivores, which is basically all the bats that we have here in the Northeast are all insect-feeding bats. But there's also fruit-eating bats, there's nectar-feeding bats, there are blood-feeding bats or sanguivores, but out of those 1,400 species, there's only 3 that actually feed on blood, and only one of those specializes on mammals, and that's the common vampire bat down here in the corner, right here. Um, and then there's even carnivorous bats. So there's this frog-eating bat here, and each species is kind of really highly tailored to whatever their particular niche is. For example, you can see the fruit bat here has really big eyes. Oftentimes you hear bats are blind, but obviously, as you can see from the size of this guy's eyes, this animal definitely relies on vision pretty heavily. There's some other cool adaptations like these kind of heat sensing glands around the leaf of this bat's nose here. So it can actually sense heat, which helps it alert in or cue in on a blood meal. And then, of course, there's the pollination factor and the seed dispersal factor, and that's what those nectivores and frugivores are doing. And that turns out to be really important ecologically, because if you think about it, if you're a plant and you can't move and you want to spread your genes to other places, right? Bats, because they can fly and they can cover such large distances, they make incredibly effective pollinators. And they really help connect populations of plants that would otherwise be completely isolated from each other. And it turns out, since bats are so good at what they do and they're such effective pollinators, certain plants are even kind of designing their flowers, so to speak, to match the needs or the particular biology of bats. So bats, in terms of their functional diversity, are actually driving the evolution and diversity of flower morphology in a lot of systems. And so you can see this really long stem here for this bat. You can see that all of these flowers don't really have a lot of coloration to them, since bats, aside from that fruit-eating bat I discussed, they're relying on other senses more than they are vision. All of these flowers have really kind of pungent smells to them, which helps the bat cue in terms of scents. And then if you're an agave here, which is the plant that we get tequila from, bats are the primary pollinators for that. And you can see these really long stems that would be really accommodating for a flying mammal. And so this is just a really great example of why bats are so kind of critical and fundamental to that functional diversity, because there's a lot of them. They can move around the landscape in really broad, vast places in short amounts of time, making them kind of structurally connecting the landscape. And then therefore that promotes that functional diversity. I already covered on one of these, but I always have to take a moment to just dispel a couple common myths about bats, because there are many myths surrounding bats. So the first, as we already discussed, bats are not blind. Again, you can see this fruit-eating bat on the top here has really big eyes, and so they're very reliant on their vision. But then even these little insectivores down here, these bottom 2 pictures, they have teeny little eyes, but that doesn't mean that they can't see. They actually do have decent vision. It's not their primary source for navigation. As you can see with the really large ears of this big-eared bat here, they're primarily relying on their ears and auditory cues for navigation, but they can definitely see. Bats do not get tangled in your hair, or at least not intentionally so. I can say this from personal experience, having stood in a cave where I literally had millions of bats swarming around my head before they went out and did their foraging for the evening, and not a single one hit me. They didn't expect me to be there. I wasn't normally there, but they knew that I was there, and so they were able to avoid me and didn't get tangled in my hair. That's not to say that it's never happened in the history of humans and bats interacting for a bat to actually like maybe make contact with somebody's head, but most likely if a bat is swooping around your head, it's either about to rescue you from a mosquito or potentially just curious. Bats are very curious about their environment and spend some time exploring things. So they're not out to get you, and they're definitely not aggressive animals. They're also not all rabid. This is a huge one. Bats are obviously, they do carry rabies, but so do all other mammals, aside from maybe opossums and potentially other marsupials. But the prevalence of rabies in wild bats in North America, as well as we can estimate it, it's a difficult thing to estimate, but we're thinking it's around less than 1% of bats that are actively carrying the virus. So not all bats are rabid. Now, this doesn't mean that you should feel comfortable just grabbing a bat with your bare hands. It's always important to exercise caution, both for your own safety and the animal's safety. If you were to handle a bat with bare hands and that bat were to bite you, then regardless of whether that bat is sick or not, that bat needs to be euthanized and tested for rabies. Rabies, while not prevalent, is a very fatal disease, pretty much 100% fatal. So it's just not worth the risk you take. And another thing on that note is that oftentimes bats will be encountered. Oftentimes they'll be on the ground. Sometimes they get grounded and they're not great at getting up off the floor. This is particularly true during the maternity season when there's young pups around. They oftentimes fall down from the roost. And so it's important to just be cautious when you're around bats, and do realize that I always get this part's confusing. An encountered bat isn't more likely to be sick, but a sick bat is more likely to be encountered, if that makes sense. So just because you're encountering a bat doesn't mean it's sick, but if a bat is, grounded or for whatever reason, it's always a potential thing. So just bear in mind, never handle a bat with bare hands. Okay, and then my favorite myth to dispel is this one. I don't know how many of you heard it. I've heard this a million times. When I tell people what they do, they're like, ew, bats are just rats with wings. And I'm like, no, no, no. Bats are definitely not rats with wings. And this is why. So this is called a phylogenetic tree, or a tree of life for mammals. And this is based on molecular data. So this is based on DNA and not just how the animals look. Bats are very confusing because they're kind of this like weird amalgam of so many different animals in terms of their appearance, that there were different kind of interpretations or theories about the origin of bats for many years. But then once we had DNA to look at, that has really kind of helped consolidate our understanding of these evolutionary relationships. And so what you can see from this tree is the similar colored nodes here, basically, or branches, are more closely related. And if we look, we can see that primates are here and rodents are here, which means we're actually more closely related to rodents than bats are. So we're more like really smart squirrels. And bats actually cluster in this really large group called Laurasiatheria, which includes a lot of different things: carnivores, ungulates, whales, even I think pangolins, various animals. But anyway, so bats are not rats with wings. And I like to call bats rebels of the night. And this is because basically, well, they're nocturnal, that helps. But bats basically break all of the rules of being a mammal, right? So typically mammals, the smaller you are, the less time you live, and the higher your reproductive output. The bigger you are, the longer your lifespan. Well, these are little teeny animals that are about 7 grams or so, just a couple of ounces in weight, and they can live up to 30, 40 years in the wild. So very long lifespans for such a small animal. And then they're also incredibly slow to reproduce. So they don't have litters. They don't have multiple litters per year. They have typically 1 pup per female per year. Now, sometimes they have twins. There are some species that have maybe 2 or 3 pups, but it's only 1 reproductive output per year. So they're very slow to reproduce, which means that any sort of population impact or drastic drop in the population will take decades to recover from. So then why should we care about bats? Well, bats are awesome. They're, like I said, they're really fantastic. They're the only animals that are capable of true flight. That makes them very unique. They're very diverse, but it turns out they're also really important in ways that are directly quantifiable and impact us as humans, which I think is kind of the thing that we're always kind of trying to drive home in ecology, that we need biodiversity and we can't really replace the things that biodiversity does for us. But giving an actual number to that, I think, is really valuable. So luckily, some scientists have done this with bats, and it turns out it's hard to do, but it's not that hard to do, and it's not that hard to figure out why bats are so important. So I mentioned that a lot of bats are eating insects. This is the majority of species that occur in the US are insectivores. And basically in 2011, kind of after white nose syndrome appeared on the landscape, and we were kind of trying to scramble to promote the well-being of bats and their conservation, This group of researchers down in Texas kind of modeled the value of bats in terms of their agricultural contributions. So this is eating enough insects that you're reducing pest damage or crop loss. And then also because you're reducing crop loss, farmers aren't using as much pesticides. So those two kind of things not only save money, but also are really valuable in terms of our health. So the number they kind of were able to model and project based on this colony of free-tailed bats in Texas was bats are probably saving us somewhere in the order between $3 and $23 billion per year. And that's a lot of money for 1 year for one group of animals. And this was back in 2011, so I couldn't even tell you what that value would look like now. And because fewer pesticides are required when bats are kind of doing their functional thing and eating a lot of insects for us, that has repercussions on our health as well. So this paper that was just recently released back in September in Science, what the researcher did was made a couple of direct observations, one of which was, we know this fungus kills bats. We know it's expanding its range, moving west. And I apologize, I'm getting ahead of myself. I will explain what white nose syndrome is to those of you who don't know in a moment. Anyway, so as white nose is kind of spread across the continent, this means that fewer crop damaging pests are being consumed by bats. Farmers are compensating with higher pesticide use. Both of those things are observable facts. And in the counties that have had impacts due to white nose syndrome in terms of a drop in the number of bats, the researcher observed higher rates of infant mortality, which is a terrible thing to hear, right? But you can see how those two things, how that observation could lead to the deduction that bats are probably doing us really important services that are not only monetary, but actually affecting our health. So, you know, bats are very important. And this becomes all the more kind of pivotal for us to be aware of and thinking about as we kind of understand more and more what the status of bats are. So back in 2023, the North American Bat Conservation Alliance put out a State of the Bats report for North America. And essentially the major finding was that nearly 50% or 47% of the 150 or so species that occur in North America, that's Canada, the US, and Mexico, are at a risk of severe decline in the next 15 years. And if you think about the fact that bats can live up to 30 years per individual, that's half an animal's lifetime. That's a very drastic and fast rate of decline. And based on all the things that we've been discussing, their role in functional diversity, that has a lot of negative impacts to a lot of ecosystem processes, and then also to human health and finance. Here's just a nice summary figure that came from this report and the 4 kind of key takeaways, which are bats are beneficial. Their extinction risk is rising due to a myriad of threats, and they depend on us. This trend will not reverse itself without action from the community and from people to prevent bats from disappearing. Okay, so I promised I would explain what I've been talking about and alluding to, which is white nose syndrome. This affects only hibernating bats, or what we call cave bats. So bats that go underground or into some subterranean system to hibernate and survive the winter by kind of shutting down their metabolism and hibernating in cold, dark spaces. So back in 2006, 2007, this was the unfortunate scene that was encountered by a lot of bat biologists as they were just heading out into the field to do their normal winter counts. We often go into these structures and these places where bats are hibernating and count them so that we can keep a census or track of the population. And in those early white nose years, this is the scene that biologists were encountering, which was just a litter of dead bats on the ground in the snow outside in February, which was definitely alarming to anybody who was there. And it turns out that it's caused by this fungal pathogen called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which is a laboriously long name. We call it PD for short. It's thought that this fungus is native to Europe and Asia. The bats, once it showed up here, people started looking for it in the old world and started to find it in caves, very widespread. But the bats would get a little bit of fungal growth on them and they would kind of wake up, maybe groom it off a little bit and be fine. They were surviving the winter. We weren't seeing these massive mortality events where hundreds of thousands of bats, or thousands or hundreds of thousands of bats were laying dead at the bottom of a cave. What it does is it basically disrupts their normal hibernation pattern. So bats do wake up intermittently throughout the winter in a normal situation. They do this to initiate an immune response and kind of, maybe stretch their wings, get a drink of water if they can. It's part of their normal physiological process during winter. However, when they're infected with white nose syndrome, the interval between those arousal events, or the number of times they wake up in the winter, increases. And so they just end up burning through their fat reserves prematurely, and they end up starving to death. This is a map. Sorry, this is 2024, so it's not the most current, but this is a good reflection of where it's at now. Moving from cooler colors to warmer colors is kind of going back in time. So that big X in New York there is ground zero. That's the first place it was recognized or observed. And it's just spread in a very radial pattern since, and is marching across the continent west. So much so that unfortunately it has now been detected in California. The disease itself is starting to show up and spread in Washington state. And then we've had a couple new occurrences in New Mexico, in Texas, and in Colorado in just the last 2 years. So it's continuing to spread. And when it arrives, it starts to cause mortalities within about the first year or two of it arriving on a scene. And it usually knocks down a population or a colony by upwards of 90, even up to 100%. So very fatal disease for hibernating bats in North America. This is just a quick graph to show you kind of the data that we have in Connecticut for how this affected the bats. So it was first documented in 2008 in Connecticut. Steep declines were observed pretty quickly. So by 2009, pretty much our populations had crashed very precipitously. We lost over 90% of our bats. So that graph on the top shows one of our kind of sentinel, our historically largest hibernaculum. And at its maximum, each of these colors is a different species, kind of the most impacted species. So little brown bats, tricolored bats, and northern long-eared bats. And what you can see is we had nearly 2,500 or so little brown bats, and about 500 each of tricolored bats and northern long-eared bats. And then by 2010, we had lost northern long-eared bats completely, and we got knocked down to about 3 and 4 of the other two species, down from almost 3,000. So an alarming loss of bats. And even many years later, so in 2023, we went in and did a survey, and we only had 7 little browns. So still very, just not recovering very quickly. Our winter numbers remain very low. I did go in this last, let's see, when was I at Roxbury? End of February, no, beginning of March. So the beginning of this month, we went in and we counted, and there were 20 little brown bats in there, which was great news because that means that there were more bats in there than even the last time we went in. And so there are some positive signs for little brown bats at least, but not such good news for northern long-eared bats or tricolored bats. They don't seem to be showing signs of recovery. And as I mentioned before, because bats have such a low reproductive potential, such drastic declines in the population really are going to take decades in the best possible case scenario, or the best conditions would take decades. We don't necessarily have the best possible conditions for any wildlife species, I would argue, due to, the hustle and bustle of human activity, various threats, habitat change, climate change. So the onus is really on us to try and manage this and help them recover as well as best we can. We also have what we call migratory bats or tree bats. These guys do not go underground to hibernate. These guys typically fly to a more southerly latitude and spend the winters in more mild climates where they're still hibernating, but in much more shallow states, and they may still have some opportunity to forage. However, because these bats are making such long movements across the landscape and in ways that we're not very good at understanding, because bats are really hard to track, especially over hundreds of miles. But that does make them more likely to encounter during their migratory movements wind farm facilities. And wind farm facilities have had a drastic impact on both birds and bats. And our tree bats in particular seem to be getting hit a lot harder. Now there's sorry about this graphic. It's very small. You guys probably can't see it, but this is just saying that we do have strategies that we're working on, and research has really helped us kind of identify some strategies that are helpful in reducing these number of bat mortalities. And that's just a matter of basically cutting down or turning off the turbines when the wind speed is too low so that the plant's not generating that much energy anyway. And the bats are probably flying more during that time when the wind speeds are low. So it really has shown promise to decrease these number of impacts and continue to help us expand our energy diversity and our energy options while minimizing impacts to wildlife. I do apologize. I know not everybody here lives in Connecticut, but obviously I'm a little biased. But most of the species that occur in Connecticut occur across the Northeast. So the kind of same goes. So we have 6 what we call cave bats, which are the hibernating bats that are affected by white nose syndrome. And then we have 3 migratory tree bats. You'll notice these blue boxes that I've painted around these, and sorry, those are the federally endangered. The dark blue box indicates our federally listed species. So these animals are listed on the federal endangered species list. And the tricolored bat is actually proposed for listing, and a decision should come out on that this year. And this is due, at least for the northern long-eared bat and the tricolored bat, exclusively to white nose syndrome. It's been such a devastating impact that it's actually driven these species to be listed as federally endangered. The Indiana bat, unfortunately, doesn't really occur in Connecticut, so I don't really include it when I think about the species that occur here. We've got 1 historic record from a long time ago. They don't seem to come into Connecticut, and we don't know of any roosts for this species. This species was actually listed as federally endangered back in, I think, the 60s. And it was making a lot of progress. It was actually the endangered species protections were working, the populations were coming back, and then white nose hit. So they have the outcome or the outlook for them has gone back down since white nose arrived. Here's some lovely mug shots of all our lovely critters. You'll notice that pretty much all of our cave bats are listed in the state of Connecticut as either threatened or endangered. I'm sorry, they're all endangered. All the white nose affected species are endangered in the state of Connecticut, except for the big brown bat. Luckily for big brown bats, they weren't as heavily impacted by white nose, and they seem to be a little bit more resistant. They're our most common species here in the state of Connecticut, and they only suffered, I say only, a 30% decline at the beginning of white nose when it first arrived. Now, a 30% decline of anything in of itself would have been alarming. But then we look at the other species that were more drastically affected, and you see that we lost upwards of 95% of those species or those populations. The tricolored bat has disappeared from about 50% of the places where we used to see it. So, you know, they're heavily protected in the state of Connecticut, and I think in a lot of our neighboring states. These are our migratory tree bats, also absolutely adorable. The eastern red bat here is our 2nd most common species. So they're doing actually pretty well. The hoary bat is, I mentioned the cousin of the Hawaiian hoary bat that I showed a picture of earlier, and these are just absolutely one of the most beautiful animals you'll ever see. You can see it's like frosty patterns and frosty tips on its coat. Absolutely beautiful animal. Oh, sorry. And then there's the silver-haired bat, which is also a very pretty bat. Not quite as pretty as the hoary bat, but okay, so what do we do in Connecticut to protect our bats? So what's my job, basically? We're kind of multifaceted in our approach to protecting these animals. The first thing we need to do is keep up with the populations and trying to understand what the populations are doing. So we do a lot of population monitoring. This means colony counts, both in the winter and the summer. We do some active radio telemetry. So up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a little bat that I've attached a radio transmitter to, and this helps us get information on what kind of habitats the bats are selecting for when they're out foraging. It can help us identify or track the bat if we catch it out on the landscape and track it back to its roost and find out where they're roosting. And then a really powerful tool that has really emerged kind of post-white nose or has been developed kind of rapidly in the last decade or so is acoustic surveys. So we can kind of eavesdrop on bats, and because of the nature of their echolocation, we can determine which species are present in a given area. We also do a lot of habitat protection. So this means putting these gates over places where we know bats hibernate. These are bat-friendly gates, so that bats can pass back and forth across the bars of these gates very easily, but a human cannot. So this really protects bats during that very vulnerable period in the winter when they're hibernating, they're trying to survive white nose, they're needing to preserve their fat, and any disturbance, additional disturbance, could be detrimental and even deadly for them. So we limit people's access to these environments. And then we put up bat houses, or we try and promote, habitat in places where we can. So bat houses are a really great way to promote bat recovery, because the females will congregate and use these structures in the summertime to raise their babies collectively. And so the more options they have on the landscape, the more choosy they can be and find that optimal bat house or that optimal structure. And then I provide a lot of technical assistance. I love to give talks to people that are interested enough to come, listen to me talk about bats for an hour. And we provide a lot of technical support to our land trusts and municipalities and conservation partners across the state. So this is what acoustic monitoring means. It's kind of one of my favorite strategies for monitoring bats, because you can it's very non-invasive. You're just going out to an area and putting out a microphone and just leaving it for a couple nights, letting it record. Or you're doing what's pictured on the right, which is called a mobile survey, where you can put a microphone and a bat detector on a vehicle, and you can drive a predetermined route and record every bat that you pass and get a timestamp and a GPS location. And then you can say on this route where you're picking up different bats. This is giving us two different types of information. So in the stationary acoustic approach, you're just leaving a detector in a location. This doesn't give you any way to give a relative abundance or estimate of the number of bats, because one bat could pass the microphone 5 times, or 5 bats could pass the microphone once, and it would be the same information that you're getting, and you don't know the difference. Whereas with the mobile stuff, you're driving a little faster than a bat is flying, so you're getting each bat, or each call that you pick up, is an individual bat, and that gives us a relative abundance measure. So one is compositional, who's here, what's the relative activity, and then one's giving you relative abundance. And as you can see from the pictures on the left here, these are what we call spectrograms. This is basically a visual representation of the sound that bats are making, what we call echolocation. And they're doing this at a really high frequency, so we can't hear it as humans, but these recorders are specialized to be able to pick up these sounds, start recording when they hear a bat, and then we get this once we pass it through a software, and we can take a look and we can actually identify down to species. In the best case scenario, it's not always perfect. Sometimes you can't get down to species, but we can at least tell phonic groups or types of bats that are there. Generally, we can get it down to species. And you can see that they just have very distinct patterns in the way that we call, and that's what we're taking advantage of when we're doing these analyses. This is a bit of a messy figure, but this is one example of one of the things that we're doing with this. I've got a detector that is placed outside of a hibernaculum, or a place where bats are hibernating. And we keep this going year round so that we can assess when the bats are returning to this location, when they're leaving, when they go into hibernation, when they come out. And these two figures compare, on the top is 2023 and on the bottom is 2024, all starting at the leftmost part of the graph is April 1st. And you can see that given differences in the temperature in the early part of that month, like in 2023, early in April, there was this drastic drop, or a night with very low temperatures. And so the bats really shifted the time that they emerge until much later, or about a week later. Whereas when we had a really warm, mild early part of April in 2024, the bats came out much earlier. And we can see that different species have different times that they come out of hibernation. And this is all just really valuable information to help us best support this population. This is another example of stationary acoustics. So I finally, heavy lift, but I was managed to go through all of our acoustic data that we've ever collected in this stationary approach and actually quantify the calls per night per species. So this is just a graph of the number of calls per night that we detected for tricolored bats. And we can do this for all of our species. And this gives us a way to model what habitats are important and what features of the habitat are important for these bats. Similarly, with the mobile acoustic data that we collect, we've got these 12 routes that are distributed across the state. These routes are driven by volunteers. It's really been an amazing thing to be a part of and come to Connecticut and see such a robust volunteership and the community really coming together to help us monitor these animals. These routes are driven 11 times per year, so 2 times per month from May through October. Alternating directions or starting points each time. And like I said, this gives us a way to kind of estimate the relative abundance. And if we look at statewide patterns from this is from 2011 to 2021, because that's all I've managed to get caught up with in vetting and processing. But if we just looked at the statewide patterns with these pie graphs here, you would see that about 75% of the calls originate from big brown bats. Remember, that's our most common species. Followed, somewhat by eastern red bats, and then about 10% of the calls were split amongst the other 7 species or 6 species, because I don't really expect Indiana bats to be involved. And so if we look at that, we're like, okay, there's a very uneven distribution of bats. But if we break this down by route, we can see that there's spatial differences in where the bats are more likely to be present versus not. So for Myotis species, this Greenwich route, these are the Gold Coast bats. They really like the landscape in Greenwich, or maybe they're just coming over from Hibernacula in New York, and that's just more convenient for them. We don't really know, but there are certain places in the state where you're more likely to encounter Myotis and more likely to encounter tricolored bats, which is the green graph here on the bottom. And what we can do with this, in addition to just kind of estimating our relative abundance for these animals, we can also use these data to, similarly to the stationary acoustics, cue in on habitat features or assemblages that seem to be important for each species. This is kind of a hotspot analysis, or where are we detecting most of these on this very fixed route. So those kind of, acoustic surveys in a nutshell, but it is a really powerful tool. It's really non-invasive. We never have to handle a bat, which can be stressful for them. We do it when we have to, or when there's data that we can't get from acoustics. But in terms of just being able to monitor bats on the landscape, this has been a very powerful tool, and it's pretty fun. One cool thing about bats is that their ecomorphology, or the way they're shaped, can really tell you a lot of information about what they do or what they eat or what habitats they are best suited for. So the frequencies that bats are echolocating at, you can have these really high frequency species, and they tend to do really well in more cluttered environments because their echolocation and their frequencies and their calls are such high frequency. There's just a lot more information that they're getting from those calls or from the return of those echoes that can help them kind of navigate very cluttered spaces much better. And then the lower frequency bats that have kind of lower frequencies and slower call rates, those tend to kind of go from being interior forest species to edge species and then to wide open species. And then that's the same with their wing shape. Their wing shape can either be designed so that they can be really maneuverable and quick in a cluttered environment, or they can be really fast and move very far distances in an open environment. And so because of this, because of the peculiarities of their biology, and they're kind of using different spaces, if we're thinking about the best ways to protect bats or to preserve bats or to enhance the biodiversity or the assemblage of bats, is to really focus on creating a mosaic of like successional stages, different forest types, different landscape types, and that's going to accommodate the greatest diversity of bat species. So you want to have a lot of edge systems. You want to have core forest, interior forest for like northern long-eared bats. They're an interior forest species. And then for our hoary bats, you want to have kind of these open fields that are within reasonable distance to a forest where they can go back and spend their days roosting in forests and in trees, and then come out and forage in these wide open spaces. So essentially, diversity begets diversity, right? So the more diverse the landscape is, the more different types of species of bats are going to be able to accommodate. Oh God, I'm going way over. Okay, the season of a bat's life is highly variable throughout the year. So they kind of have these very important features. They have 2 migratory periods in the in the spring and in the fall, when they're moving between their summer sites and their winter sites. And then they have their summer habitat, which is where the females are really getting together in a colonial fashion and raising their offspring together. This is a very energy costly or high energy demand period. And then they all have to fatten up enough so that they can migrate and get to their hibernation stage or their winter grounds and survive low resource periods. So very complicated. And so when we're protecting bats, right, this kind of adds complexity to our strategies. It makes it challenging because we have to think about not only these very specific places where bats are utilizing in the summer and the winter, but connecting those features in terms of how the bats are moving between those sites. And then within each period, they've got to be able to have access to water, to foraging sites, and appropriate roosting sites. So it's kind of big picture. There's a lot of things to consider when you're protecting bats. So that's what I do. But there's a lot you can do for bats as well. The first would be providing habitat. So I mentioned that bat houses are a really important tool that we have where we can provide habitat to bats. This can be really useful in situations where people have bats that are utilizing their attic or their barn, and they don't want them using those spaces anymore, but they don't want to hurt the bats. So you can put out a bat house in strategic ways and provide alternate habitat for the animals. There's a really great resource that just came out from a group in Canada that kind of goes through in a very simple way. There's a very complicated, long document, but then there's also a nice digestible brochure that kind of talks about the key factors that you should think about. And really what the key factors are is that you want to give the bats options. So Ruth Cutler here, pictured here next to her barn. This barn is completely dedicated to the bats. You can see multiple bat houses on the outside of the barn. And then on the inside of the barn, there's also bat houses inside there, and they're allowed to use basically, they've just kind of co-opted the whole upstairs of this barn, and she lets them and she manages the landscape for them, which is really amazing. She's been an incredible steward, and she actually hosts or is the steward of the largest little brown bat maternity colony that we have in the state. So we love Ruth. You can also plant a lot of native species. Anything that supports insect diversity or your pollinators is going to also support bats, since bats are eating the pollinators. But essentially, again, diversity begets diversity. And if you provide native habitat, that's going to benefit bats. I mentioned that Ruth has the largest colony of bats, and so I want to give a little bit of good news for bats because it's not all doom and gloom. While our winter numbers are not coming back, we are seeing some really positive trends in this one maternity colony, such that in the last several years, it's more than doubled, tripled even. So it seems like it bounced around and was like stable at low levels for about 10 years following white nose syndrome. And then in the last couple years or so, it really has started to bounce back. So we're very excited about that. Another way you can help with bats is help us count bats. We have a sentinel colony here at White Memorial Conservation Center in Litchfield, Connecticut. It's got this big green barn, which is literally called the Big Green Barn. And it's home to a maternity colony of big brown bats that have been using it for decades. And what we did is we went and we put 4 live stream cameras, one on the outside of the roost where the bats come out, and then 3 on the inside, so we can kind of get different perspectives of them while they're in the roost, which is really cool. I'm going to see if this is just going to play. So we ask people, and it's an opportunity for people to contribute to data collection in the state, where you can, go on to the website and just start watching the bats. There's a little Google data sheet that you can fill out to collect those data. And you just count the bats as they come out and submit that count to us. And that's helping us collect data so that we can really get a very clear idea of how this population is changing with respect to the environment, with respect to climate over time. Okay, sorry. It's also fun just to be able to understand what bats are doing. They're a fairly cryptic group of animals, and we don't often get to watch them be bats, especially when they're in cute little colonial clusters like this. So there's other types of questions that we can answer with these cameras, not just how many bats are there, but how do the bats socially interact with each other? How active are they inside the roost at various times of day, or with respect to temperature or weather patterns? Or if you just are a geek like me and like to watch cute animals do cute things, it's fun to just kind of log on. And And then another thing that we really can get from this is phenology. So how do bats' behaviors and activities, the seasonal timing of those events, such as returning from hibernation or parturition, which is when the babies are born, how does that vary over time and with respect to different variables such as climate? Last year, I was logging in and I was fortunate enough to see a baby bat being born. I just happened to cue in on this female and I noticed that she was grooming and I saw this, and then she moves and she had twins. So I know I said they only have one pup per female per year, but big brown bats are capable of having twins. But it hasn't been observed very frequently. So for us to actually catch one on camera and have it recorded was cloud nine moment for me. I was thrilled, and they're very cute. So, oops. You can also monitor colonies if you're in the state of Connecticut and you have a bat colony. We have a bat program and an email system where you can send those counts to us, which is a lot of fun. You can report bat sightings. This was really important right after white nose. You can see there's a lot of reported sightings early on. It's tapered off a little bit, but just to show again how important the community is to this, to understanding these animals and caring about these animals. We have a really great community in the Northeast, I think, or in Connecticut I can speak to, but you're all here, so I'm going to extend it out to the Northeast. Brad mentioned this earlier, and actually we funded a study out at Great Hollow Nature Preserve, which is on the far kind of western side of the state. It's this beautiful property. They have this amazing wetland. And so what the director of research did was he went out and he put a big floodlight in the middle of this wetland. And he would alternate nights that the floodlight would not alternate, but just randomly select a night to be on or the lights to be off on any given night. And then there were acoustic detectors placed at 0, 25, 50, and 75 meters from that light source. And when looking at the data, we can see these are basically the results. If the lights are off, you know, the bats are ubiquitous. They're present at all of those distances, no difference between the distances in the terms of number of bats that you detect. But on the nights where the lights were on, there were 0 little brown bats. Like the little brown bats avoided this completely. And this effect lasted up to as far as 75 meters away from that light source. So what that tells us is that up to 75 meters from any light source is precluding certain species of bats, and especially these white nose affected species, from foraging. So you're cutting off their habitat, or you're limiting their habitat just by having lights on. So if at night you can turn those lights off during the summertime, that'll be beneficial to bats. We also have, in September of every year, we have Bat Day. This has been a really great event. It's been a lot of fun. It's at Old Newgate Prison in East Granby, which is not only the oldest prison in all of New England, which is amazing and creepy, but cool. It's also a place where the bats hibernate. So in September, when we hold the event, the bats aren't there yet, but you can do a tour of the hibernaculum and the mine and kind of see where the bats do spend their winter times. And it's gotten bigger and bigger every year. So we appreciate spreading the word. If you know people that are bat enthusiasts, tell them to come visit us in September at Old Newgate Prison. Here's some contact info, my email address, or the Deep Bat program. The links to there's 2 ways to access the Bat Cam, either through the Deep website or through White Memorial. So just some links there for you. And with that, and I went way over time and I apologize. Thanks for bearing with me. I wanted to give some love for some Western species because I'm from California. So these are some other lovely Western bats that we don't get here. And with that, I will take questions or comments.
Devaughn, that was absolutely amazing. And don't worry about going over. Oh my God. I think everyone was just eating it up. I know I was. And thank you, like, from all of us, right, for this amazing work you do. I mean, it's just so important. Um, I'm going to encourage folks to just use the chat to ask questions, and then I can just read them to you, Devaughn, and then we can answer that way. I do see one. What would you say is the best entry point for newbies like me to support bat populations? Bat houses, pollinators, all the above. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, all of those things that I mentioned, if you're interested in creating habitat for bats, the bat house approach is fantastic. The main takeaway there, and I can definitely Brad maybe give you more information and you can distribute it. I don't know if you can
Absolutely.
link it with the, but in terms
Yep.
of these resources that are coming out, these best management practice resources, the Bat House one, the key takeaway home there is that the more options you give bats, the better. So you can have some dark colored bat houses, some light colored bat houses. That's going to change the temperature inside those roosts. On really hot days, the bats are going to kind of want to seek out cooler places. So having something in the shade or that's not in the direct sun all day will give them that kind of thermal refuge to escape to. Similarly, on really cold days, they're going to get into that black bat house that's nice and warm, and they're going to tuck up real high into that, and that one should be in the sun. Um, so kind of, stratifying the houses themselves is a really powerful way to do that. Um, and yeah, just creating habitat and spreading the word. Bats, one of the biggest challenges bats face is just a really bad kind of PR. Um, you know, they don't, people perceive them as much more of a threat or much scarier than they are. So spreading the love. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I've done a lot of snake research, so same there too. It's that
Mhm.
public perception, misperception, really
Misperception. Great.
on those. And I thought your point was fat. I mean, I had no idea about that we're more closely related to rodents than bats are to rodents. Like,
Yeah. That's one
I,
of my
I didn't
favorite.
know that. That's amazing. Like,
Cool.
amazing fact. Like, so, um,
Yeah. I get that all the time. They're like, "Oh, they're just rats with wings." And I'm like, "Wipe that disgusting look off your face real quick and let me teach you."
Yeah, no, that's incredible. Oh yeah, here's a tough question for you. Probably hard to choose, but what's your favorite bat?
Oh, so this little guy here, I don't know if you guys can even see my mouse. If you can't,
Yes,
and
you
I
can.
was
You can, yeah.
okay. So this is a pallid bat. And this is probably one of the cutest pictures of a pallid bat I've ever encountered in my life. I'm absolutely obsessed with this species. I just love them. Different species of bats kind of have their own personalities when you capture them. Like big browns, I call them feisty fuscus because they're a Tessicus fuscus and they're very feisty. They're just like angry bats and they just want to get away. Pallid bats will literally like wrap themselves in their wings and like hide from you and just be like, oh God, just tell me when it's over. They're very sweet bats. I also really like the free-tailed bats, which is pictured here on the right. I like to joke with people that this picture makes them look like a Jim Henson character or like a Muppet. So they're very sweet bats, very good temperaments. But I don't know, bats are just amazing. If you go to the old world and you've got the fruit bats that are like 6 foot wingspans, they're fascinating. So it is hard to pick.
It's amazing. And you said, what is it? 20% of all mammal species are bats in the
Yeah.
world? Is that
Yeah.
accurate? Wow.
They're very diverse.
Yeah. So another question just came up. Typically, how far away is a bat's summer habitat from its winter habitat?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's one that every bat biologist would like a better answer to. They're very hard to track, the transmitters that we can use for bats. They can't be solar powered because the bats aren't flying during the day. Um, and they can't weigh more than 5% of the animal's body weight so that the batteries don't last long. But we've got some information from banding studies. So if you band a bat in the summertime, and then you can see where if you happen to encounter that band somewhere in the winter time. So that's some of the ways that we've gotten at that. Some people have been successful with telemetry studies. Short answer is it can vary and it can be as little as, maybe 5, 10, 15 miles, and it can be as great, depending on the species, upwards of 500 miles. So they can really make long distance movements. And then when you talk about the migratory tree bats, hoary bats can probably move thousands of miles in their migratory movements.
Wow.
Far.
Yeah, that's impressive for such a small animal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, they're amazing. They're amazing. Everything about them is so cool. I'm
yeah.
biased, but
And I have a question about it was great to see, I mean, it's so stark to see, right? Those numbers going from 2,500 down to like literally zero, or
Mm.
three. And thinking about how long it will take them to recover in like you said, best case scenario. Has there been any, genetic work done to, those that are surviving? Is there any genetic basis on that or, any ideas?
It's a question close to my heart. My former life before I worked for Deep, I was a genomics biologist or a conservation genomicist. So we actually did a lot of work with white nose and natural selection and Um, and we weren't the only group. A lot of groups have kind of approached this. Turns out genomes are really complicated. Evolution is really complicated, and bats in particular, because they fly and because gene flow can be really widespread, and they're kind of mixing between their summer and their winter. They basically there's not a lot of population structure, which means the genetic diversity is kind of just evenly spread across the landscape. And so that can make it really hard to detect patterns of selection. Um, but it turns out that kind of depending on what population you sample to explore this question, it looks like there's different strategies or different genes that are being selected on due to selection from the fungus. So different populations are kind of handling this in a different way, but they're all kind of similarly themed. So genes related to the storage of brown adipose fat tissue, and fat metabolism emerge as appearing to be selected in survivors of whiteness syndrome. Things having to do with hibernation behavior. So what we are noticing, not from the genetic side so much, although the genetic side supports this, is that bats are shifting the way that they're using the space in a hibernaculum. There can be microclimates inside of a cave or a tunnel. Some places are warmer and drier, some places are colder and wetter. And the bats in general seem to be shifting where in the cave towards.
Oop,
Um,
lost
when
you
they're
there.
high.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Am I back? Sorry.
You're back. Yeah,
Um,
no worries.
I
Um,
forgot to unconnect from my client earlier. Yeah, so I'm making this a really long answer to a really great question, which is different populations are handling it differently. But yes, there's definitely signs within the genomes of surviving bats that suggest that natural selection is playing a role in helping these populations recover. And we kind of know that from Europe too, right? This disease probably did have a major impact on hibernating bats when it first emerged, or that fungus first learned how to colonize bats, maybe 40,000 years ago or whatever. So the bats, we don't see the population effects in European bats anymore, and the bats have all figured out how to tolerate this fungus through natural selection. The difference is that when that happened, some probably 40,000 years ago, there were a lot fewer threats to bats, and they were able to uh, return to those numbers. So
awesome.
that
Yeah.
was a really long answer. Sorry.
No, no, that was yeah, and I hadn't realized that they had finally pinpointed it down to Europe. I know early on, right? It was like an unknown fungus. It had previously not been described. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
And it was only through subsequent, yeah. One more question. We will do one more here, this last one. So insectivore bats, do they eat only flying insects?
No, that's a really great question. So some bats are, there's kind of two strategies. If you're an insectivorous bat, you can be an aerial hawker, which means you're like catching insects on the fly. So those will be those really dramatic pictures where you'll see a bat swooping up a moth in flight and kind of throwing it into its mouth and catching it and flying off. There's also what we call gleaners. So some species do specialize by gleaning insects off of vegetation, such as the northern long-eared bat. And this turns out to be really important because a lot of like pest species aren't necessarily flying around at night, and could be like just resting on the vegetation structure themselves, but the bats are still helping suppress those pest populations.
Amazing. Wow. I
Mhm.
didn't realize that either. I just assumed it was all flying insects. Okay. Yeah. Um, well, Devaughn,
Spiders, bats even eat spiders.
they do.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, then you might have fans, right? People that don't like spiders for the
Yeah.
same reasons, you know? But yeah, this was absolutely amazing, Devaughn. Thank you so much for you and your colleagues, all your work. Um,